I'm glad I didn't have to tell you why you suck. So, August 24th, 2011 was a big day for me. It was a week before my 26th birthday. It was my first day of what would have been my second year in an MFA program in studio art. And it was also the day that I got quite unexpectedly diagnosed with cancer. This shouldn't have come as such a surprise to me because the year before I was completely exhausted. I needed 2 naps a day in order to function, and I was constantly tight in the chest. And I know some of you are thinking that you feel that way on I-5 or at work, but rest assured, you're probably okay. I was very privileged in many ways, not the least of which was that I was an art student, so I had a habit of making things, which was a built-in coping mechanism. Now, I'm sure you can relate. When I got diagnosed, I was terrified, and it went beyond just confronting my mortality for the first time. It was also because, as a young adult, I took for granted how much my self-concept was tied to my identity as a healthy person, and I just kind of assumed that my cells would be able to regulate themselves. On top of that, I had to get used to a new reality in the hospital, which involved a lot of tests and a lot of waiting, and that was frustrating for me because I had to rely on doctors, medicines, and machines to tell me things about my body that I previously thought that I knew. And then on top of that, I had to move back in with my parents, and I was losing my hair, and I couldn't eat sushi for 6 months or drink wine, and so this was a really rough time for me. It's interesting for me to look back on my early drawings. By the way, these are my drawings that I made when I first got diagnosed. And I consistently represented cancer as something that was outside of me, this evil, sinister substance. And later when I researched, I found out that the ancient Greeks diagnosed cancer as an abundance of black bile in the body. And I think it's really interesting that thousands of years later and advances in modern medicine later, I was coming to the same visual conclusion. I started my treatment, which was 6 months of outpatient chemotherapy, and I was on 4 drugs, and the first drug was bright red, and it went through an IV, and it looked, I'm not kidding you, like cartoon poison. And that thin red line became a symbol for me that connected me to the hospital constantly like an umbilical cord, both pulling me forward and tying me up. And I had a really interesting relationship with chemo that was complicated because I was voluntarily ingesting this poison designed to kill a part of myself in order to heal the rest. Towards the end of chemo, I started researching galaxies, fighter jets, flocks of birds, any unified formation that I could find. And I didn't realize until later that I was doing this as part of sort of stemming from that impulse to control my cells and regulate them. And there was one night that I was lying in bed, and I used to feel around with my breath in my chest to see if I could still sense the snag of the tumor. And I realized that I could take a deep breath for the first time in recent memory, and that was so beautiful that I started to cry. And I realized that cancer cells aren't inherently evil. They are cells of my body's own creation, and that process couldn't be just reduced to a language of wins and losses. This is crazy what I'm about to show you. So in the New York Times a couple weeks ago while I was prepping this talk, there was an op-ed piece about getting a cancer diagnosis, and that was the illustration. And isn't it crazy that the ancient Greeks, the New York Times, and I all arrived at the evil, scary black hole as the default visual representation of cancer? When I got back to school in remission, I made it my goal to look for new ways that we could represent illness that better reflect embodied truths about it. And I got really interested in arts and healthcare programs around the country designed to impart patients with the same studio practices that I had and infuse art into the hospital space. I got a grant to come to Seattle to research our excellent arts and healthcare program at Harborview Trauma Center, and I learned from the fabulous coordinator, Peggy Weiss, who's in the audience tonight. And it was that visit, in part, that informed my decision to move here 2 years ago. And I'm going to end on one note because randos on Facebook ask me this all the time. If you know someone who gets diagnosed with cancer, the absolute best thing that you can get them is a sketchbook or a diary or some way that they can record their experiences, because it's going to give them a tool to empower them and cause them to see that experience in a completely new light. And I finished early, but wait for it. You should get them socks. This talk is not endorsed by the sock monster, because when you're immunosuppressed and you're on chemo, trust me, good pair of socks are a good thing, and whenever they see them, they'll think of the great friend that got them for them. Thank you.